Mom, why are you still living in my house? My son asked me that question on my 70th birthday, while I was standing in the kitchen holding his favorite chocolate cake. Claire laughed softly into her wine glass like she'd already heard the joke before. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there looking at the blue candles melting slowly into the frosting, while the people I loved waited to see what I would say. I'm Margaret Whitmore, and until that moment I believed the house around us still belonged to my family. I just didn't realize anymore that I was the only one still calling it mine. The dining room smelled like roasted chicken, buttered rolls, and the vanilla candles I had placed along the center of the mahogany table earlier that afternoon. I had spent nearly 9 hours cooking for my birthday dinner. Not because anyone asked me to. Not because 70 felt important. But because family dinners used to mean something in this house. The old grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily in the silence after Daniel's question. Tick, tick, tick. I could hear the faint hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen, and the laughter of my grandchildren outside on the patio. Claire finally leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs carefully beneath her cream-colored dress. Daniel's just being practical, she said with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I mean, this place is huge for one person. One person. The words settled heavily in my chest. 41 years earlier, Richard and I had walked through this exact dining room carrying boxes from our first apartment. The wallpaper had been peeling then. The hardwood floors were scratched beyond repair. We slept on an air mattress for nearly 6 months while Richard worked double shifts at the power company, and I took bookkeeping jobs from home to help cover the mortgage. Every inch of this house carried our fingerprints. The kitchen cabinets Richard built himself. The maple tree we planted when Daniel turned 5. The small crack in the hallway wall where Daniel crashed his bicycle indoors during a thunderstorm when he was 10 years old. Yet somehow sitting at my own birthday table I suddenly felt like a guest. Mom, Daniel said again, this time softer, almost uncomfortable. You know what I mean. I looked at him carefully. At 44, my son had started resembling his father more every year. The same broad shoulders. The same gray beginning to touch the edges of his dark hair. But Richard had never looked at me the way Daniel was looking at me now. Like I was standing in the way of something he already considered his. I set the cake down carefully beside the plates. I didn't realize I needed permission to live here, I said quietly. Claire gave a short laugh before quickly lifting her wine glass again. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. That's not what I meant. But it was exactly what he meant. I could hear it underneath every careful word. Claire reached for another dinner roll and glanced toward the kitchen window. We've just been thinking long term, she said. Especially now that maintenance costs keep going up. Long term. Maintenance costs. They spoke about my life the same way people discuss old furniture they haven't decided whether to keep. I nodded slowly and walked back toward the kitchen before either of them could see the expression on my face. The sink was full of dishes soaking in warm water. Outside the window, the backyard lights glowed softly against the wooden fence Richard painted himself 2 summers before he passed away. I gripped the edge of the counter and breathed slowly through my nose. Somewhere behind me, Claire lowered her voice. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. You should have brought it up sooner, she whispered. Daniel answered too quietly for me to catch. Then Claire again. The realtor said the market's perfect right now. Realtor. My stomach tightened instantly. I stayed perfectly still, my fingers wrapped around the edge of the counter, while cold understanding slowly settled into place inside me. This conversation hadn't started tonight. It hadn't even started this month. Maybe not this year. Suddenly little things from the past few months began fitting together in ways I hadn't noticed before. Claire asking strange questions about property taxes. Daniel insisting on handling small repairs himself. The afternoon I came home from grocery shopping and found Claire taking measurements in the living room with her phone. Just curious, she had said cheerfully when I asked why. I stared out at the backyard where Richard's old porch swing moved slightly in the evening breeze. Then I heard Claire's voice again, low and casual. Once we renovate the kitchen, the value will jump another $100,000 easily. Renovate the kitchen. My kitchen. The one Richard built with his own hands. I closed my eyes for just a moment. Then I opened them and looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. For the first time in 70 years I realized something terrifying. My son wasn't waiting for me to leave this house someday. In his mind, I already had. The house felt different the next morning. Not louder. Not emptier. Just unfamiliar somehow, as if something invisible had shifted overnight while I slept. I woke up before sunrise the way I always did and sat quietly at the edge of my bed listening to the pipes hum softly inside the walls. Richard used to call this house alive because it always made little sounds in the morning. The heater clicking on. The coffee maker sputtering downstairs. The old floorboards settling after a cold night. Usually those sounds comforted me. That morning they only reminded me how alone I felt. I slipped on my robe and walked downstairs slowly, running my fingers along the banister Richard refinished by hand nearly 20 years ago. The kitchen still smelled faintly like birthday cake and candle wax. Half of the dishes from dinner remained stacked beside the sink because Claire insisted they would clean everything before leaving. They never did. I stood there for a long moment looking at the untouched plates and half-empty wine glasses scattered across the counter. Claire's lipstick stain still marked one of the glasses near the sink. Daniel's napkin sat crumpled beside his chair at the table. It looked less like a family dinner and more like evidence left behind after something unpleasant. I reached automatically for my coffee mug from the cabinet above the stove, but it was gone. I frowned and opened the cabinet wider. The shelf looked strangely empty. Then I noticed all my mugs had been moved lower, stacked beside the newer white dishes Claire bought last month without asking me if I wanted them. I stood there staring at the rearranged shelves longer than I should have. It was such a small thing. Just dishes. Just cabinets. But suddenly I realized how many small things had changed recently without my permission. The framed family photos that disappeared from the hallway. The antique lamp from Richard's study that Claire said looked dated. The quilt my mother stitched by hand folded into a closet because it did not match the new guest room colors. None of it happened all at once. That was the clever part. Little changes arrive quietly. By the time you notice them, you are already living inside someone else's decisions. I poured myself coffee and carried it toward the back door. The backyard grass glistened with morning dew beneath the pale October sunlight. Richard's porch swing moved gently in the wind. I wrapped both hands around my mug and sat down at the patio table where Richard and I used to eat breakfast together every Sunday morning. I could almost hear his voice sometimes if the house was quiet enough. "You worry too much, Maggie," he would say whenever I got anxious about Daniel growing distant after marriage. "He is just busy building his own life." Maybe Richard had been right then. Or maybe neither of us wanted to admit what was really happening. The back door suddenly opened behind me. Claire stepped outside wearing expensive cream-colored workout clothes and carrying her phone. She looked surprised to see me sitting there. "Oh," she said lightly. "You are up early." "I live here," I replied before I could stop myself. Her smile tightened just slightly. "Right. Of course." She walked across the patio toward the yard, barely looking at me. Then she raised her phone and slowly turned in a circle recording the backyard, the fence, the landscaping, the patio furniture, even the kitchen windows. I watched silently while cold unease crept slowly through my chest. "What are you doing?" I asked finally. Claire lowered her phone casually. "Just sending pictures to somebody." "Somebody?" "A designer," she answered too quickly. "I was talking to someone about possible renovations." Renovations. Again that word. My grip tightened around the coffee mug. "That seems unnecessary." Claire shrugged. "Well, if Daniel and I are going to stay here long term, the house needs updates." "Long term? Stay here." She said the words naturally, confidently, as if the decision had already been made somewhere without me. Then her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and walked farther into the yard before answering. But the morning air carried her voice back toward me anyway. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think we are getting close." I stared down at the steam rising from my coffee cup while a terrible realization settled deeper inside me. They were not waiting for me to leave willingly anymore. They were already planning the life they intended to build after I was gone. 3 days later, I drove to the bank because I needed to replace one of my old certificates of deposit before it renewed automatically. It was cold that morning. The kind of October cold that settles into your hands before winter even officially begins. I wore Richard's old wool coat even though the sleeves were slightly too long on me. It still smelled faintly like cedar and aftershave. The parking lot was half empty when I arrived. Inside, the bank looked exactly the same as it had for years. Soft beige carpets. Quiet instrumental music playing overhead. A bowl of peppermint candies near the reception desk. Familiar places become dangerous when your life starts changing because they remind you how stable things used to feel. Margaret! A cheerful voice called from behind the counter. I looked up and saw Linda Harper smiling warmly at me. Linda had worked at the bank for nearly 20 years. She processed Richard's retirement accounts after he passed away, and once cried with me quietly in her office while I signed paperwork I barely understood through my grief. "Good morning, Linda," I said softly. "You staying warm out there?" she asked. "Trying to." She walked me toward her desk carrying a folder beneath one arm. "I was actually surprised to see your name pop up this morning," she said. Casually. "I thought your son already moved everything into the trust months ago." I stopped walking, just for a second, but it was enough for Linda to notice. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I probably misunderstood something." "What trust?" I asked carefully. Linda blinked at me. "Oh, well, Daniel came in earlier this summer asking general questions about property transfers and family trusts. I assumed the house paperwork had already been handled." My stomach tightened so suddenly I thought I might feel sick. "Handled how?" Linda shifted uncomfortably in her chair after we sat down. "Margaret, I really should not discuss someone else's financial questions." I nodded slowly. "Of course." But neither of us spoke for several seconds. Linda looked down at the folder in front of her before finally sighing quietly. "He mainly asked about avoiding probate issues if a parent passes away while living with adult children." It sounded routine. Adult children living with a parent. That was not how Daniel described it. In his version of reality, I was already living in his house. I folded my hands tightly together in my lap to stop them from trembling. "Did Claire come with him?" Linda hesitated briefly. "Yes, of course she did." I stared past Linda's shoulder toward the large windows facing the parking lot. A young couple crossed the street holding coffee cups while laughing about something I could not hear. Their lives looked simple from a distance. Clean. Untangled. I remembered when Daniel used to hold my hand crossing parking lots because he was afraid cars would not see him. He used to wait every afternoon near the front window when Richard came home from work. He used to draw pictures of our house with smoke curling from the chimney, and all three of us standing in the yard smiling beneath a bright yellow sun. Somewhere between then and now, my son had started speaking about me like a temporary problem to solve. Linda cleared her throat gently. "Margaret, are you all right?" I forced a small smile. "I think so." But the truth was I no longer knew. Because once suspicion enters your life, it changes the shape of everything around you. Suddenly every memory develops. Sharp edges. Every conversation sounds different when replayed in your mind. Daniel insisting on keeping copies of utility bills. Claire asking whether I had updated my will recently. The strange moment last spring when Daniel joked that maintaining a large house alone at my age was becoming unrealistic. At the time I laughed politely because I thought he was worried about me. Now I understood something much colder. They were not concerned about my future. They were planning it for me. Linda finished processing my paperwork while I sat quietly pretending to read forms I could barely see clearly anymore. Before I left, she touched my hand gently across the desk. "If you ever need help understanding your accounts, Margaret, you call me directly." I looked at her carefully. Maybe she saw something in my face because her expression softened immediately. "Thank you," I whispered. Outside, the wind had picked up. Dry leaves scraped across the parking lot around my shoes as I walked slowly toward my car. Then I stopped beside the driver's door because I suddenly remembered something Claire said during dinner months ago. "This neighborhood is becoming incredibly valuable." At the time it sounded harmless, casual even. But standing there beneath the cold gray sky, I realized Claire had never once talked about this house like a home, only as an asset. That evening the house was unusually quiet. Claire had taken the children to some after-school event, and Daniel was still at work downtown. For the first time all week, I could hear the natural sounds of the house again. The refrigerator humming softly, the clock ticking near the staircase, wind brushing against the maple tree outside the living room window. I stood alone in Richard's study holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold in my hands. Claire rarely entered this room. She called it cluttered, too dark, too old-fashioned. But Richard loved this room because it still looked exactly the way he wanted. Walnut bookshelves covering the walls, leather chair near the fireplace, framed photographs from fishing trips taken 30 years ago. Even after his death, I could still feel him here sometimes. Not in some dramatic way, just in the quiet order of things. Richard believed every object should stay where it belonged. My eyes drifted toward the old oak desk in the corner. The bottom drawer remained locked, exactly as it had been since the day he passed away 3 years earlier. I had not opened it once. At first because the grief hurt too much. Later because life simply became smaller after losing him. Days blur together when the person who shared your routines disappears. I set my tea down carefully and knelt beside the desk. The small brass key still rested inside the ceramic bowl on the bookshelf where Richard always kept it. My fingers hesitated before lifting it. I suddenly remembered the last conversation we had in this room. Richard sat in his chair wearing his reading glasses low on his nose while reviewing paperwork. "If anything ever happens to me," he said casually, "promise me you will never let anyone push you out of this house." I laughed back then because the idea seemed impossible. Who would push me out? He looked at me for a moment longer than usual before smiling faintly. "People change, Margaret. Especially when money gets involved." At the time I thought he meant strangers. Lawyers. Banks. I never imagined he might have meant our own son. The lock clicked softly as I turned the key. Inside the drawer sat neatly organized folders, old insurance documents, property records, and several sealed envelopes. Richard always believed important papers should stay in one place. "Confusion ruins families faster than greed," he used to say. My chest tightened as I carefully lifted the top envelope. My name was written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Margaret. Just that. Simple and steady. I opened it slowly. The paper inside crackled softly beneath my fingers. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then something in this house no longer feels right to you." I sat down heavily in Richard's leather chair. Outside, evening shadows stretched slowly across the backyard while I continued reading. Richard explained that several years before his death, he had quietly restructured ownership of the house and our financial accounts through a trust, managed entirely in my name. Not Daniel's. Not shared. Mine. He wrote that he loved our son deeply but had started noticing changes after Daniel married Claire. "Small things at first," Richard wrote. "Conversations about inheritance before there was anything to inherit. Questions about property values. Assumptions disguised as jokes." I pressed my hand against my mouth as tears burned suddenly behind my eyes. Not dramatic tears. Just the exhausted kind that arrive when somebody finally confirms what you were afraid to admit to yourself. Richard saw it before I did. He saw the slow shift happening inside our family, while I kept trying to preserve peace. Near the bottom of the letter, one sentence stopped me completely. "If Daniel ever forgets who built this home, remind him." I lowered the paper slowly into my lap. The room around me felt perfectly still. Then another sound drifted faintly through the house. The front door opening downstairs. Daniel's voice. Claire laughing softly beside him. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. For the first time since my birthday dinner, something inside me settled instead of breaking. Because fear changes once truth enters the room. And suddenly I understood something Claire and Daniel still did not know. Richard had prepared for this long before any of us realized there would be a war over this house. The next morning I started paying attention in a way I had not before. Not emotionally. Quietly. Carefully. Like someone walking through a familiar neighborhood after learning there had been burglaries nearby. Suddenly every open window feels dangerous. Every strange noise matters. Claire was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She stood at the counter scrolling through her phone while the coffee machine brewed behind her. "Morning," she said without looking up. "Good morning." I moved toward the cabinet for my mug, but before I reached it, Claire spoke again. "Oh, I reorganized some things yesterday. Your teacups are on the lower shelf now. It is safer that way." Safer. Such an innocent word. Yet somehow it sounded exactly like control. I nodded politely and reached for the shelf. She indicated. The cabinet smelled faintly like the vanilla-scented liner Claire recently added inside all the drawers. I hated that smell. It reminded me of hotel lobbies pretending to feel warm. Daniel and I were talking last night, she continued casually. We really think you should stop using the upstairs laundry room. I turned slowly toward her. Why? The stairs are steep. I have used those stairs for 41 years. Claire smiled tightly. Exactly. I poured my coffee in silence while she returned to her phone. A moment later, Daniel walked into the kitchen adjusting his tie for work. Morning, Mom. Good morning. He kissed Claire lightly on the cheek before grabbing a banana from the counter. Then his eyes landed on me. You doing okay today? The question sounded rehearsed somehow, like a doctor checking symptoms. I am fine. You sure? He asked carefully. You seemed upset after dinner the other night. I stirred cream slowly into my coffee. Did I? Daniel shifted awkwardly. Mom, nobody is trying to hurt your feelings. Claire looked up immediately. We are just thinking realistically about the future. There it was again. The future. Always discussed like I was not expected to remain part of it. I carried my mug toward the breakfast nook beside the window. Outside, the maple tree leaves had started turning deep orange. Richard loved this time of year. Every October he used to rake leaves into giant piles for Daniel to jump into when he was little. I remembered standing in this exact kitchen doorway years ago watching them laugh in the yard together while sunlight covered everything gold. Families disappear slowly sometimes. Not through one terrible moment. Through hundreds of small replacements. New habits. New loyalties. New voices becoming louder than old ones. Claire suddenly laughed softly at something on her phone. Oh my goodness, she said. The Henderson house sold in 4 days. Daniel looked interested immediately. What did they get for it? Almost 1.3 million. Claire shook her head in disbelief. Can you imagine? Daniel whistled quietly. That is insane. Neither of them noticed I had stopped drinking my coffee, because I realized something important in that moment. They talked about houses constantly now. Property values. Renovations. Market timing, taxes, equity, but they never talked about memories. Never about Christmas mornings in the living room. Never about Richard building the back deck with his bare hands during one unbearably hot July. To them this house was square footage and profit margins. To me it was my entire adult life. Claire finally glanced toward me again. Honestly, this neighborhood is too valuable not to think strategically. Strategic. Another cold little word wrapped in politeness. Daniel checked his watch and grabbed his keys from the counter. We should probably start discussing long-term plans soon anyway. He said it casually while slipping on his coat, like we were discussing weather forecasts instead of my home. I looked directly at my son for several quiet seconds. He avoided my eyes almost immediately. That hurt more than the words themselves. Because guilty people rarely hold eye contact for long. After they left for work, I remained alone at the breakfast table listening to the silence settle back over the house. Then I remembered something Richard once told me during an argument with a contractor many years ago. The person who stays calm usually knows more than everyone else in the room. I sat there staring at the steam rising from my coffee cup. Then I stood up slowly and walked back toward Richard's study. Because for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer interested in defending myself emotionally. I wanted facts. And somewhere inside those folders Richard left behind, I suspected there were more truths waiting for me. Richard organized everything with frightening precision. That was the first thing I realized after spending nearly 3 hours inside his study going through folders and handwritten notes. My husband never trusted chaos. Every document sat neatly labeled inside dark blue binders arranged by year. Property taxes, insurance policies, investment accounts, legal correspondence. Even now, 3 years after his death, it felt like he was still trying to take care of problems before they could reach me. Outside, rain tapped softly against the study windows while the house remained empty. Claire had taken the children shopping, and Daniel was still at work. The quiet gave me room to think clearly for the first time in weeks. I opened another folder marked trust documents and slowly read through pages filled with legal language I barely understood at first. But certain words stood out immediately. Sole beneficiari. Irrevocable. Primary residence protected. I adjusted my reading glasses and read every page again more carefully. Then a third time. By the end, my hands had stopped shaking completely. The house belonged entirely to me. Not partially. Not temporarily. Completely. Richard had transferred ownership years before his death through a protected trust specifically designed to prevent outside claims or forced sales. Even if Daniel assumed otherwise, legally he had no authority over this property while I remained alive. I leaned back slowly in Richard's leather chair and closed my eyes. Relief arrived first. Heavy and overwhelming. But it did not last long. Because relief quickly gave way to something colder. Betrayal feels different once you realize somebody tried to take something they knew was never theirs to begin with. A smaller envelope slipped from between two folders onto the carpet beside my feet. Picked it up carefully. My name appeared again in Richard's handwriting. But this time another sentence had been added underneath. Open only if you begin doubting yourself. I stared at those words for a very long time before opening the envelope. Inside sat a single sheet of paper folded neatly in half. Margaret, the letter began. If this letter reaches your hands, then I was right to worry. My chest tightened immediately. Richard explained that 6 months before his death, Daniel approached him privately asking questions about inheritance timelines and ownership transfer. Richard wrote that the conversation unsettled him deeply. Not because Daniel asked about money, he explained, but because he spoke as though the future of this house had already been decided without you included in it. I lowered the letter slowly. Rainwater streaked down the windows beside me while thunder rolled softly in the distance. I remembered that period clearly now. Daniel suddenly offering to help with bills. Claire bringing brochures about retirement communities disguised as thoughtful suggestions. At the time I interpreted their behavior as concern. Richard saw calculation instead. Near the bottom of the letter, another sentence stopped me completely. You spent your life protecting everyone else's comfort, Margaret. Do not sacrifice your dignity to preserve the illusion of peace. I pressed the paper flat against the desk and stared at Richard's handwriting until my vision blurred slightly. The strange thing about betrayal is that it often hurts less once somebody finally names it honestly. For weeks I kept trying to convince myself I misunderstood Daniel and Claire. That maybe I was becoming too sensitive, too emotional, too old. But Richard had already confirmed what my instincts were trying desperately to tell me. This was not misunderstanding. It was entitlement. I carefully returned the documents to their folders just before I heard the front door open downstairs. Voices drifted faintly through the house. Claire laughing. Shopping bags rustling. Daniel asking what was for dinner. Ordinary sounds. Almost comforting if you ignored the truth hiding underneath them. I locked the drawer quietly and returned the key to the ceramic bowl on the shelf. Then I looked around Richard's study one last time before leaving. The room no longer felt like a place filled with grief. Felt like evidence. And for the first time since my birthday dinner, I understood something important. Daniel and Claire believed they were slowly cornering a helpless old woman inside her own home. What they did not realize yet was that Richard had already handed me everything I needed to stop them. The strange thing about finally understanding the truth is that fear begins disappearing in small pieces. Not all at once. Quietly. Like ice melting off a driveway after a long winter. The next few days I stopped reacting emotionally to Daniel and Claire altogether. Instead I watched them. Listened carefully. Paid attention to details I would have ignored before. Claire noticed the change immediately. You seem quiet lately, she said one afternoon while unloading groceries onto the kitchen counter. Just tired, I answered calmly. She studied me for a second too long before smiling politely. Well, maybe that is your body telling you something. I almost laughed at how transparent she had become now that I knew where to look. Every conversation somehow circled back to aging, safety, simplifying life, smaller homes, retirement communities with fitness centers and organized activities. Claire spoke about those places the same way real estate agents describe vacation resorts. Warmly, smoothly, without emotion. That evening during dinner, Daniel cleared his throat halfway through the meal and set his fork down carefully. Mom, he began, Claire and I have been researching some really beautiful senior living communities nearby. I continued buttering my dinner roll without looking up. Have you Some of them are honestly more like resorts, Claire added quickly. Movie theaters, gardening clubs, transportation services. Interesting, I said softly. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with her before continuing. We just think eventually it might make things easier for everybody. Easier for everybody. I noticed he did not say easier for me. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and gave a small nod. Maybe you are right. Both of them looked surprised immediately. Claire blinked twice. Really? 70 is not young, I replied quietly. I suppose I should start considering practical options. The relief on Daniel's face appeared so quickly it almost hurt to watch. He looked like a man who had finally escaped a financial problem. Claire reached for her wine glass, hiding the small smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. In that moment I realized something important. They wanted surrender more than conflict. They expected tears, resistance, emotional scenes. They were prepared to paint me as difficult. What they were not prepared for was patience. Over the next week I played my role carefully. I moved slower around the house. I mentioned occasional fatigue even when I felt perfectly fine. Once I deliberately paused halfway up the staircase while Claire watched from the kitchen doorway. Her eyes sharpened immediately with quiet satisfaction. You should be careful, she called out sweetly. Those stairs worry me. I smiled faintly. They worry me too sometimes. That night I heard her whispering excitedly to Daniel in the living room after they thought I had gone upstairs. She is finally accepting reality, Claire murmured. We need to move quickly before she changes her mind. I stood silently in the dark hallway listening to my own son answer. I know. Just those 2 words. Calm. Certain. I returned upstairs slowly and sat alone on the edge of my bed for a very long time staring at the framed photograph beside the lamp. Richard and I stood together on the front porch 30 years earlier holding paintbrushes covered in white primer, while Daniel grinned between us missing his 2 front teeth. Back then this house represented stability, family, permanence. Now it felt like territory people were quietly negotiating over, while pretending nothing ugly was happening. The following Tuesday, while Daniel and Claire were both out, I drove downtown to meet with the attorney whose name Richard had written inside the trust documents. His office occupied the 3rd floor of an old brick building overlooking the courthouse square. The waiting room smelled faintly like coffee and old paper. A young receptionist offered me bottled water while I waited. Then finally a silver-haired man stepped into the lobby holding a folder beneath one arm. Mrs. Whitmore? He asked warmly. I am Charles Bennett. Your husband spoke very highly of you. Something inside my chest tightened unexpectedly hearing Richard mentioned by someone who still remembered him clearly. Charles led me into his office and closed the door quietly behind us. Then he opened the folder and looked directly at me over his glasses. Now, he said gently, why do I get the feeling your family suddenly became very interested in your house? Charles Bennett listened without interrupting while I explained everything. Daniel's comments during my birthday dinner. Claire discussing renovations behind my back. The conversations about retirement communities that suddenly happened almost every day now. He sat quietly behind his desk with both hands folded together while rain streaked softly against the tall office windows beside him. When I finally finished speaking, the room stayed silent for several seconds. Then Charles removed his glasses slowly and sighed. Your husband anticipated something like this might happen, he said carefully. Richard updated these protections twice during the last 5 years of his life. I looked down at the folder resting on the desk between us. Somehow hearing it spoken aloud made the situation feel even heavier. He never told me. He was trying to protect you, Charles replied gently. And honestly, Margaret, he was trying to protect Daniel from himself. That sentence stayed with me long after our meeting ended. Protect Daniel from himself. Because deep down, I knew my son was not naturally cruel. Weak maybe. Easily influenced. Desperate to impress Claire. But not cruel by nature. That almost made everything harder. Charles spent the next hour carefully explaining every legal protection Richard established. The house could not be sold without my direct approval. No inheritance transferred automatically before my death. No financial authority belonged to Daniel whatsoever. And there is something else, Charles added quietly while turning another page inside the folder. Your husband included a clause restricting Daniel's inheritance entirely if any attempt was made to pressure you out of the property through manipulation or coercion. I stared at him in shock. Richard did that? Charles nodded slowly. Your husband was a very perceptive man. By the time I returned home that afternoon, the rain had stopped and pale sunlight covered the neighborhood in silver reflections. Claire's SUV already sat in the driveway. I walked inside carrying only my purse and umbrella, but emotionally I felt like I was carrying something much heavier now. Knowledge changes the balance inside a room even when nobody else realizes it yet. Claire stood in the kitchen arranging flowers in a white ceramic vase. You were gone a while, she said casually. I stopped for coffee. She glanced toward me briefly. By yourself? Such a strange question. But I smiled softly. I enjoy my own company. Claire laughed politely, though I noticed the tension flicker briefly across her face. Daniel came home an hour later carrying takeout containers from an Italian restaurant downtown. Thought nobody would feel like cooking tonight, he announced while setting bags on the counter. During dinner, both of them behaved unusually pleasant toward me. Claire complimented my sweater twice. Daniel asked if I needed help organizing the garage before winter. Felt rehearsed somehow, like kindness performed slightly too late. Halfway through the meal, Claire finally brought it up. Actually, she said carefully, Daniel and I were thinking maybe this weekend we could sit down together and discuss some paperwork. I lifted my water glass slowly. Paperwork? Nothing serious, Daniel added quickly. Just future planning stuff. Claire smiled warmly beside him. Things like medical preferences, property planning, making sure everybody is protected. Protected. Another polite word hiding sharper intentions underneath it. I set my glass down quietly. That sounds reasonable. The relief that passed between them happened so fast they probably believed I missed it. Daniel relaxed back into his chair immediately. Claire's shoulders loosened for the first time all evening. They truly believed I was surrendering. The realization almost saddened me more than it angered me. Because somewhere along the way, my own son started mistaking silence for weakness. After dinner, I stood alone at the kitchen sink rinsing plates while their voices drifted softly from the living room. Claire whispered something excitedly. Daniel laughed quietly in response. Then I heard Claire say 4 words that made me stop moving completely. We are almost there. I stared out the dark kitchen window toward the backyard where Richard's porch swing moved gently beneath the porch light. Almost there. Like I was some obstacle nearing completion instead of a mother who spent decades loving them. Slowly, I dried my hands on the kitchen towel and folded it neatly beside the sink. Then I smiled faintly to myself for the first time in weeks. Because Saturday dinner was no longer going to unfold the way Daniel and Claire expected. Saturday arrived cold and clear. The kind of crisp autumn afternoon where sunlight makes everything look warmer than it actually feels. Claire spent the entire morning cleaning the house even though it was already spotless. Candles burned in the dining room. Fresh flowers sat in the center of the table. Daniel kept checking his phone every 20 minutes like a man preparing for an important business meeting instead of dinner with his mother. I stayed calm. That seemed to unsettle them more than anything else. Around 5 o'clock, Claire appeared in the doorway of my bedroom holding a pale blue blouse draped over one arm. I thought this color might look nice on you tonight, she said sweetly. I almost smiled at the performance of it all. Thank you, I replied softly. Downstairs, the dining room glowed beneath the chandelier Richard installed himself nearly 25 years earlier. Roast chicken filled the air with the smell of rosemary and garlic. Wine glasses sparkled against the polished mahogany table. Everything looked beautiful. That was always Claire's talent. She knew how to make manipulation appear elegant. Halfway through dinner, Daniel finally cleared his throat and reached beside his chair for a leather folder. There it was. The moment they had been building toward for weeks. Mom, he began carefully. Claire and I worked with somebody to organize a few documents that might make future planning easier for everyone. Claire smiled beside him and slid a pen slowly across the table toward me. Nothing complicated, she said gently. Mostly authorization paperwork in case emergencies ever happen. I folded my napkin carefully into my lap before looking down at the folder. Property transfer discussions. Medical authority forms. Preliminary estate transition agreements. They truly thought I would sign everything quietly because they wrapped it in polite language. Daniel leaned forward slightly. We just want to protect you. I looked directly at my son for several long seconds. Then I asked the simplest question in the world. Protect me from what? Silence settled instantly across the dining room. Claire recovered first. From stress, maintenance responsibilities, future uncertainty. Future uncertainty. Such careful words. I nodded slowly. I see. Then I stood up from the table. Claire blinked in surprise. Margaret. Excuse me one moment, I said calmly. I walked out of the dining room and down the hallway toward Richard's study, while my heartbeat remained strangely steady inside my chest. When I returned a minute later, I carried a dark blue folder beneath one arm. Daniel's expression tightened immediately. I sat back down quietly and placed the folder on the table between us. Before we discuss your paperwork, I said softly, I think we should review Richard's paperwork first. Neither of them spoke. I opened the folder carefully and slid several documents across the table toward Daniel. Trust agreements, property records, legal statements bearing official seals and signatures. Claire picked up the top page first. I watched the color slowly drain from her face while she read. Daniel frowned and grabbed another document. What is this? He asked sharply. Your father protected this house years ago, I answered calmly. The property belongs entirely to me through an irrevocable trust. Daniel looked stunned. That cannot be right. It is. Claire turned pages faster now, her hands suddenly unsteady. Then Daniel reached the final section and stopped moving completely. Mom! His voice sounded smaller suddenly. Younger somehow. There is also a clause, I continued quietly, restricting inheritance rights if pressure or manipulation is used to remove me from my home. The silence afterward felt enormous. Claire lowered the papers slowly back onto the table. Daniel stared down at the documents like they had betrayed him personally. For the first time in weeks, nobody mentioned practical solutions. Nobody spoke about retirement communities or future planning or safety concerns. Because suddenly the illusion had collapsed. They could no longer pretend this was about helping me. Dad did this. Daniel asked finally. I nodded once. Your father saw things more clearly than I did. Claire stood abruptly from the table and walked toward the kitchen without another word. Daniel remained frozen in his chair staring at the papers while the candles flickered softly between us. He looked ashamed. Not angry. Just ashamed. And somehow that hurt more. I folded my hands together calmly on the table Richard and I bought during our second year of marriage. Then I looked at my son and spoke as gently as I could. This house was never waiting for you to inherit while I was still alive, Daniel. He finally lifted his eyes toward me then. For the first time in a very long while, he looked at me not like an obstacle or a problem to manage. Just his mother.